Why do we admire Dravot most at the exact moment the story proves he's a fraud? At the end of The Man Who Would Be King, he is exposed. He bleeds. The illusion collapses instantly. And then, he becomes convincing. He walks calmly toward execution. He does not beg. He does not break. He carries himself like a king. We know he isn't one. And yet, this is the moment that feels like dignity. The scene is usually read as the completion of a tragic arc. Dravot rises through ambition, overreaches, and falls. His claim to divinity collapses the moment he bleeds. The illusion breaks. The punishment follows. Structurally, it is clean, almost classical. And in his final moments, he seems to recover something. Composure, even nobility. A kind of last-minute integrity. The fraud becomes, briefly, a tragic figure. It's an interpretation that feels right on first contact. The story appears to reward him with a dignified ending. But that feeling depends on something we don't usually question. Because Dravot does not become admirable despite being exposed. He becomes admirable after it. At the exact moment the story proves he has no legitimate claim to power, no divinity, no authority, nothing but performance. He gives his most convincing performance yet. And we believe it, not intellectually. We know he is a fraud. The text makes that undeniable. But effectively, the story still persuades us to admire him. That tension is not a flaw in the narrative. It is the point where it becomes most revealing. Dravot's authority has always depended on performance. His kingship is not built on force alone or even on strategy. It is built on symbols, rituals, and the careful management of belief. He becomes a god because others accept the role he plays. But that performance has a limit. It requires distance. It requires mystery. It requires the illusion of something beyond the human. The moment he bleeds, that illusion collapses instantly. What is striking is not the collapse itself, but what follows. The structure that sustained his power is gone. The audience, those who believed in him, no longer believes. And yet, Dravot continues. He carries himself with the same composure, the same authority, the same insistence on his role. The performance persists even after belief has been withdrawn. In fact, it becomes purer. Because now it is no longer supported by anything external. No army, no ritual, no shared illusion. Just a man insisting on being a king as he walks to his death. And this is where the story becomes dangerous. Because this is the moment that reads as dignity. The temptation is to treat this composure as redemption. As though Dravot, stripped of illusion, reveals some underlying truth about himself. Courage, perhaps, or resolve. Something that justifies, retroactively, the scale of his ambition. But nothing in his final act undoes what came before. His empire was built on deception, on coercion, on the manipulation of beliefs he neither understood nor respected. That does not disappear because he dies well. What changes is not the reality of his actions, but the frame through which we see them. The narrative shifts our attention. Instead of looking at what he did, we look at how he dies. And in that shift, something uncomfortable happens. We begin to admire him. This is where the absence at the center of the story matters. The people he ruled, the Kafirs, are never given full interiority. They appear first as believers, then as the force that turns against him. Their role is collective, functional. They are the audience to his performance. And when they stop believing, they become the mechanism of his fall. But their perspective, their reasoning, their interpretation of what has happened is largely inaccessible. We do not see Dravot through their eyes. we see them through his, and that asymmetry shapes the emotional logic of the ending. Because if their perspective were fully present, if their experience of deception, of manipulation, of imposed authority were central, the final scene would not read as dignity. It would read as justice. Instead, their action becomes a backdrop. The execution becomes a stage. And Dravot remains the only character whose inner life we are invited to follow to the end. The rope bridge concentrates all of this into a single image. It is often treated symbolically, a threshold between illusion and reality, life and death. But it is also something more concrete. It is the structure that allowed Dravot to enter and dominate this space in the first place. A means of access. A point of control. Now it becomes the site of his exposure. The same structure that enabled his rise now enables his fall. That symmetry feels poetic. It gives the ending a sense of inevitability, of closure. But it also does something else. It contains the entire arc within his experience. The bridge is not just a crossing, it is a frame. And within that frame, the story remains his, even as he loses everything else. What the story reveals, then, is not just the fragility of imperial power. It reveals something more unsettling about how that power is perceived. Because Dravot's authority was always a performance. And yet, even after the performance is exposed as false, it continues to produce the same effect. Admiration, not because it is believed, but because it is convincing. The story does not simply depict a man who mistakes himself for a king. It shows how easily the appearance of authority can become indistinguishable from the real thing. Dravot does not regain legitimacy in death. He demonstrates that legitimacy was never the point. What mattered was the performance. And the performance holds, even when everything else collapses. That is why the ending feels dignified, not because he deserves it, but because we are still responding to the role he plays. And this is the final discomfort. The story does not just expose the illusion of empire. It exposes how little it takes for that illusion to work. Because even after we know Dravot is a fraud, even after the narrative proves it, we still grant him something like greatness. We call it composure, or courage, or dignity. But it is the same instinct that allowed him to rule in the first place, the same willingness to mistake performance for authority. Dravot walks to his death as a king, not because he is one, but because even at the end, we are still willing to see him that way. The illusion doesn't disappear. It just changes audience.